For exercise 33, the human cardiac physiology, we're going to build on some of the concepts we've already discussed. But first, we're going to start with talking about something called the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycle is going to essentially be the heartbeat. And it is a cycle, so it's going to start and end and then kind of repeat. So there's two pieces to the cycle, as we've talked before with the heart. You've got your atrium and your ventricles. Blood will come in through your atrium, down into your ventricles, and then out to either the pulmonary or the systemic circuit. This process, this cardiac cycle, is going to involve two pieces. There's going to be a period of contraction by the chamber, and that contraction is going to be the atrium or the ventricle. It doesn't matter. It's going to be contraction. And then it's going to have a period of relaxation. And cycling between these two gives us the cardiac cycle. From now on, whenever we talk about contraction, we're going to use the word systole or systole. It's been pronounced both ways. And anytime we talk about relaxation, we're going to talk about diastole. So contraction will be systole, and relaxation will be diastole. And as we talked earlier with a cardiac cycle and looking at an EKG, there was this pattern that kind of looked like this. And we talked about where there were going to be periods of atrial contraction. Well, now that atrial contraction is going to be atrial systole. We talked about a period of ventricular contraction, which is now going to be called ventricular systole. And we talked about a period where after you have the contraction, both of these chambers need to go through the relaxation. So there's also going to be a period of atrial and ventricular. Instead of relaxation, it is going to be diastole. So that is where we are starting this chapter. All of these are concepts we've already talked about, with your atrium needing to contract, squeezing the blood down into your ventricles ventricles needing to contract and squeezing the blood out the top. But then both of those chambers need to go through a period of relaxation. We're just now using the systole and diastole term for that. And a cardiac cycle is actually going through these sequences. So when we are talking about a cardiac cycle and we're cycling through these periods of diastole or systole, it is going to be considered one complete heartbeat. So for it to go through this entire cycle, it's going to be one complete heartbeat. And for this to occur, it is going to be all atrium and ventricles are going to go through the process of contraction and then the process of relaxation. So everything has to go through systole and diastole to kind of keep it in perspective. So when we're talking about what you call a heartbeat, it's also called a cardiac cycle. So we're just kind of changing that term a little bit. So when this process really works, I'm going to be replicating page 487 in your lab manual, and it's essentially going to be the events of the heart. This is a very kind of complex interplay of a bunch of different processes and a bunch of different things. So we're going to kind of talk through this a little bit, but essentially I'm going to be replicating just page 47, and I believe it is figure 33.1. But we're going to talk through kind of what that means. So with this period of our cardiac cycle, or the events in the heart, the first thing that's going to happen is we are in this stage of this. So when we are in the stage at the very, very beginning, there is essentially complete heart relaxation. At this particular point, nothing is happening. So what are our atrium doing and what are our ventricles doing? When we are at the phase of complete heart relaxation, your atrium is going to be relaxed. So that means you will be in diastole. And your ventricles will also be relaxed. So you will be in diastole. So nothing's actually being contracted. When we have this paradigm, and we're going to talk about three things for each one, we're going to talk about the pressure in the heart, what is going on. We're going to talk about the blood, what direction and where the blood is going. And then we're also going to talk about all of our valves, all of the doors between all of these chambers. So at each phase of our cardiac cycle, we're going to talk about these three things. So when we are in the first phase of our cardiac cycle, we are in complete heart relaxation. Both our atrium and our ventricles are going to be in diastole. If our heart is cardiac muscle is not being contracted, there is no pressure. That means overall the pressure inside our chambers is going to be low, both in the atrium and in the ventricles. Remember, nothing is contracting, so it is a relaxed muscle. A relaxed muscle is a very low pressure. With this relaxed pressure system in complete atrium and ventricles, atrial and ventricular diastole, we're also going to have our blood is going to be moving essentially passively into our heart. So with this particular system, it is going to be going into our heart and then down through this. So this is coming from your system, your systemic circulation, and then from your pulmonary circulation. Remember, the blood is also coming in. And it is essentially moving passively through the atrium and through the ventricles. So I'm going to go ahead and give you that one. So it is passively flowing from atrium to your ventricles. And in order to do this, remember there are little doors between our atrium and our ventricles on the right and the left side, and then there's also going to be a door to leaving your heart as well. So those are our AV valves and our semilunar valves. So we've got two sets. Our AV valves, there's a right and a left, and our semilunar valve, and there's a right and a left. So just remembering all of those from another exercise. In this particular paradigm, if we have blood passively moving, and passively means it's essentially just following gravity, it's coming into the heart and then just falling down, following essentially just gravity. So in this paradigm where we have blood passively flowing from our atrium to a ventricle, these doors right here by nature have to be open. So your AV valves have to be open. Otherwise, you would not be able to have blood go from your atrium to your ventricles. But since our blood is not leaving our heart, our blood is going to stay in our atrium. That means that these other valves right here, our semilunar valves, are going to be closed. So blood can come into the heart. Blood is moving down from the atrium to the ventricles by gravity, essentially. But the door leaving the heart, the semilunar valves, are going to be closed. So this is complete heart relaxation. This is a passive movement of blood. So now we're going to do that same thing. We're going to look at the second part. So here we are in our atrium and our ventricles, our paradigm. In this second part, we are actually going to be in atrial contraction. So I had mentioned in one of the previous exercises that the heart is squeezed from the top down. So the atrium are first. So we are going to contract the atrium. So that technically means you will be in atrial systole. Your atrium are going to contract. I have not said anything about the ventricles. So up here, our ventricles were in diastole, so that means down here, our ventricles are going to stay in diastole. So we are only contracting the top of the heart. And with this contraction, we're going to look at pressure. We're going to look at the blood flow, and we're going to look at our valves. We are only squeezing the top part of the heart. So remember, our blood has come in and it has passively flown, moved down, and now it's sitting in our ventricles essentially. So with our atrial contraction, we are going to squeeze the top of our heart together. So our right and our left atrium are going to squeeze. When you squeeze something, the pressure is going to increase because you are squeezing something. And as you continue to squeeze the pressure in your atrium, so we're right here, if you were to take a rag at home and you're wiping down the sink, cleaning dishes, doing whatever you need to do, and you were to take that rag and it's wet, hold it over the sink and let it drip, that would be the passive movement of water, just like the passive movement of blood. It's dripping down. But now if you take that rag and you actually twist it so you are squeezing the water out, you are increasing that pressure and more water will come out of the rag. That's synonymous to the atrium squeezing and then more blood being pushed down into the ventricles. So we are increasing the pressure in our atrium, and when we're increasing the pressure in the atrium, we're going to squeeze that, and our blood is going to move. Woo, so sorry, wrong color. The blood is going to move from your atrium to your ventricles. We're going to squeeze all of that blood out. We have not changed anything with our valves at this point. We still are going to have our AV valves open, and we are still going to have our semilunar valves closed. So we're squeezing all the blood out from the atrium into the ventricles, but the door leaving the ventricles is closed. So we're essentially pooling all of the blood in our ventricles. So that's step 2. Step 3 is going to be a ventricular contraction. So we've squeezed our atrium, and now we are going to squeeze our ventricles. And if we are in ventricular contraction, we're going to talk about what our atrium and our ventricles are doing. So I haven't mentioned anything about our atrium changing. So up here we were in atrial systole, so that atrium is contracting. You're still going to be in atrial systole. So you are still going to keep contracting the top part of the heart. But now what we're doing is we're contracting the ventricles. So you are going to be in ventricular systole. So now this is the first time that both your atrium and your ventricles will be in a contracted ventricular systolic state. So if we were to take our little heart and blow them up, atrium, ventricles, we have essentially pulled all the blood in, and then we have squeezed all of the blood down. So we have squeezed all of the blood down. And now what we're doing with our ventricular traction is we're actually going to be squeezing the blood, and the only place for this blood to go is out. So this blood right here is essentially going to go to the lungs, whereas this blood, when it's leaving the left side of the heart, is going to go to the body or the system. So with a ventricular contraction, we're going to still have our atrium in systolic pressure, so it's still going to be squeezing. We are now squeezing our ventricles, and we are squeezing the blood out of the heart. So that means if we are looking at our pressure, our blood, and our valves. Our blood, we are essentially squeezing, and this blood is actually being pushed out of the heart. either going to the lungs or it is going to the body, but it is out of the heart. If our ventricle is going to be in systole, that means it is an increase in pressure. This is a very, very, very high pressure. This is the highest you're going to get because we have all four chambers of our heart contracting at the same time. And now one other thing about this is we have valves. Remember, we have our AV valves on the right and left, and we have our semilunar valves on the right and left. If we are going to have our blood leaving out of the heart, so we are pushing this blood out of the heart, that means the doorway leaving the heart must be open. So that means our semilunar valves are now open. Previously, our semilunar valves were closed. So now we have the valves or the doorways leaving our heart open. But if we are now squeezing our ventricles, we don't want the blood to go back. Because remember, our cardiovascular system is a one-way road. So we don't want the blood to go back. So that means in order for the blood to only go out, we have to close the doors that are going backwards. So your AV valves, the valve or the door between your atrium and your ventricles, are going to close. So that way when you squeeze your ventricles, the blood goes forward. It does not go backwards. So we have gone from a period of your atrium and your ventricles in diastole. They're both relaxed. Then we go through a period where your top of your heart, your atrium, is going to contract, but your ventricles stay relaxed. So you're going to squeeze the blood down. After you go through that, you're going to go through a period of ventricular contraction where the top is still squeezing, but then now the ventricles are going to squeeze. So now all four chambers of your heart are squeezing at the same time. This is a high amount of pressure. It's the highest you're going to get in your heart. It is pushing all of the blood out of your heart, either to your lungs or to the rest of your body. And in order to do this, your semilunar valves are open and your AV valves between the chambers of your heart are closed. With this particular paradigm where you have your atrium and your ventricles both contracting at the same time, this is called isovolumetric contraction. Iso means same, so it's the same amount of contraction, essentially. So that's what's happening in this phase. So after we go through any kind of contraction, the next thing that we're going to have to do is go through some sort of relaxation. So we're going to blow this guy up and see if I can get him back for you. So we've gone through atrium contracted, ventricles contracted. Now we're going to have to relax all of these chambers of the heart. Okay. So we're going to do that the same way we did step 2. We're going to start with our atrium. So our atrium contracted first. So that means our ventricles, our atrium, are going to relax first. And this is going to be atrial relaxation. So in atrial relaxation, our atrium is now going to go back to diastole, right? Because it's in a relaxed state, where our ventricles have not changed. So in the period before up here, our ventricles were in a contracted state in systole. So down here, we haven't changed our ventricles, so our ventricles are still going to be in systole. So in this paradigm, we have the top of the heart starting to relax, and the bottom of the heart still contracted. So keep in mind with what we know about pressure, blood, and our valves, we're going to do all three of those. So when we have this, our pressure in general is going to start to decrease because we are going from all four chambers of our heart to only two chambers of our heart contracted. So the pressure in our heart is going to start to decrease. But what we're also going to look at is what our valves are doing. So remember, we have the valves. The blood has just been kicked out of our heart. So the valves we're looking at are the ones that were the doors leading the heart. If we relax our atrium, we do not want our blood to flow back. We do not want this to happen. It's a one-way pathway. You do not want your blood to flow backwards. So that means once our ventricles squeeze and the blood is out of our heart completely, our valves, we have two sets. The valve that is the one where the blood leaves the heart, our semilunars, these guys are going to close. This is a change because previously our semilunar were open, but now our semilunar are closed. We haven't talked about our AV valves, but they are going to stay the same. So these are going to be closed. So now all of the valves in our heart are actually going to be closed. From this phase, we go to number 5. And in this particular one, we are doing ventricular relaxation. So in ventricular relaxation, our atrium is in the same state he was in the position before, which means he's in diastole still. So it'll be in, let's do that in the correct term. He's going to be atrial diastole. Now our ventricle is starting to relax. So it is going to go from ventricular systole to the relaxed state, which is ventricular diastole. And I spelled this one wrong. I apologize. So now we have our atrium and our ventricles both in a relaxed state. When we are here, what is happening with our blood? What is happening with the pressure in our heart? And what is happening with our valves? So in this state, our atrium and our ventricles, we have relaxed both our atrium and our ventricles. So for this, that means we have just finished squeezing all of the blood out of our heart. So now our blood will enter. So we just finished squeezing all of the blood out of our heart. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take, our heart is essentially empty, and we are going to have all of the blood start to enter our heart. And as the blood enters our heart, it's coming from the system or it is coming from the lungs. And as this blood is entering our heart, it's going to do what it did before. It is going to passively move into our ventricles. So it's going to enter the heart and then it's going to move from your atrium to your ventricles. In order to do this, if we are moving blood passively through our heart because we are in diastole, that means the pressure is very, very low. It's able to passively move from the chambers. There is no squeezing pressure attached to it, so there is no, so it's a very low pressure. If we're doing this and we have the doors or the valves between our atrium and our ventricles, in order for the blood to go from the atrium to our ventricles, our AV valves must be open. But if we have blood coming into our heart, we do not want it to kick out. We don't want that. So in order for that to not happen, we need to take these other doors and close them. So our semilunar valves are going to be closed. This allows blood to enter our heart, move through our atrium down to our ventricles, and pool. Or move into our heart from our lungs, move down into our ventricles, and pool. So that way the door leaving the heart is now closed. So in this state, we're in ventricular relaxation. But one thing you've got to look at is this right here. We are in ventricular relaxation. Our atrium and our ventricles are both in diastole, and our valves, our AV valves are open, and our SL semilunar valves are closed. If we take this process and we go all the way back up to the top, look at what we have here. All the way back up to the top. We have our atrium and our ventricles in diastole, and we have our AV valves open and our semilunar valves closed. It is the exact same thing. Phase 5 in ventricular relaxation is going to then restart, and essentially you will cycle through phase 2. So you will go through a period of atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, atrial relaxation, ventricular relaxation, and then you are going to repeat. So this is where we get the cardiac cycle from. This is essentially, this process right here is the cardiac cycle, and it moves through these processes. Okay, so a couple things with our cardiac cycle is that when we're looking at this whole thing, the average heartbeat of a adult is going to be around 75 beats per minute. So that is beats per minute. So 75 beats per minute. A cardiac cycle, so going from atrial contraction to ventricular relaxation, going through that cycle, takes approximately 0.8 seconds. So with this cardiac cycle, that means atrial systole, you will be in this period right here, atrial systole, for about 0.1 seconds. Your atrium squeeze very, very fast. After atrial systole, you go through atrial diastole, and then you're going to go through ventricle systole. So remember, your atrium, after it contracts, it has to relax. But then our ventricles are starting to contract. This process right here kind of happens brief second, but it's going to be total 0.3 seconds for your ventricles to contract, and for the brief time period that your atrium are going to relax. And then after your ventricles contract, you are going to go through the same process where you have to have your ventricles relax. So that's going to be ventral diastole. And this part will take about 0.4 seconds. So that means looking at these numbers, which adds up to 0.8 seconds for a cardiac cycle, your heart spends most of its time in a relaxed state. So your heart spends most of its time relaxed and filling with blood. It spends less time in a contracted state. So that's just something to keep in mind. With this cardiac cycle, oh, if you were to hear the term lub-dub, what we are talking about is these are your heart sounds. They're commonly known as lub-dub. This is going to be your AV valves closing, whereas this is going to be your semilunar valves closing. So lub is your AV valves closing, which means coming up here, we are going from our AV valves as open right here to our AV valves as closed. So these two right here is lub. So we're contracting our atrium and our ventricles, and we're closing our AV valves. That's the sound that you hear when you hear through a stethoscope, is the top lub. The second one is going to be your semilunar valves closing. So that means if we have our semilunar open here, and then our semilunar close here, this part is going to be the dub. And essentially what it is it is thump thump. So when you hear your heartbeat and it's the two-piece bump bump, bump bump, bump bump, bump bump. Essentially what it is you are hearing the AV valves closing and then you're hearing the semilunar valves closing. But to get incredibly technical, thinking about how these valves are organized and what they look like. Remember, these valves are going to be either made up of 2 or 3 flaps. So here's the tube going between our atrium and our ventricles. And remember, they were our inverted umbrellas. So if we are on the right side of the heart, and our AV valves looked like that, and then if we are on the left side of that heart, our AV valves were like this. Because remember, these ones were a bicuspid, whereas this was a tricuspid. So bicuspid is 2 valves. Tricuspid is some version of 3 valves. And what we're saying with these is when blood moves through and these guys close, what you are actually hearing when we say that the AV valves are going to close on either the right or the left side of the heart, we're talking about these same ones right here, with these guys right here, with our AV valves closing, what you're technically hearing is going to be the blood hitting the valve. So we're not hearing the actual slam of the door, essentially. We are hearing the smack of the liquid or the blood hitting the door that just closed. So you're technically hearing the wave of blood hit the closed valve, but we can liken it to the AV valves are closing. So that's going to be going from our atrium to ventricles with our first heartbeat lub dub or lub thump. If we take the second one and we're on the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, and we are essentially trying to get our blood to leave the heart, the door that it has to go through here is our right semilunar and our left semilunar valve. And when these valves close, what you're hearing is the same thing. You are hearing the blood hit the closed door. So you're not hearing the valve close, you're hearing the blood hit the closed valve. So you're still hearing that wave against that closed valve. So that's what you're hearing. From a clinical standpoint, anytime that we listen to someone's heartbeat and are trying to ascertain any pieces of that, that is called auscultate. And I always mispronounce this, and I apologize for that. This is what you are doing when you are listening through a stethoscope. You're listening to the heartbeat. What you're doing with this is you're listening to see if you're hearing a normal thump thump, which corresponds to a normal atrial contraction and a normal ventricular contraction. So that's what you're listening to. If you hear a murmur, so you guys have all probably heard of a heart murmur, this is going to indicate a valve problem or a valve issue. A murmur means that you are hearing the blood hit a door or the blood hit a valve that is not working correctly. So that means the valve hasn't shut correctly, it's letting some blood through, there's lots of different issues. So these murmurs will indicate a valve issue because you're hearing an incorrect thump thump. That's really what's going on. So you have 4 valves. Remember, you have your right and your left atrioventricular, and then you're going to have your right and your left semilunar. So these 4 valves, you can have a murmur at any of them. Usually murmurs are going to occur on the left side of the heart, mainly. That's where a lot of the bigger issues kind of come into play, but a murmur can account for any one of these valves having issues. So whether or not it's the blood flowing down and the door is shut from the atrium to the ventricle, or the blood is trying to flow out of the heart and it can't through the semilunar valves. That is what a murmur is. Okay, so a couple other things for this exercise, staying in the clinical world a little bit. We're going to talk about pulse. What does pulse mean? So pulse lives in the world of the cardiovascular system, and pulse is the alternating pulse of pressure that is going to be against an arterial wall. So if we are going to have all of the blood coming through our heart, leaving our heart, here we go. Our blood is leaving our heart. It's now rushing through our vessels. As it's going it's going to hit the walls of our heart. The walls of our blood vessels as it goes. That is what we are measuring through pulse and blood pressure. So to break it down a little bit, when we are actually looking at, when we're looking at pulse, how do we actually measure this, guy? So pulse is going to be done off of systolic pressure over diastolic pressure, which means the pressure when the blood is leaving the heart because the heart is contracted. Remember, that's what systole means. And it's going to be the heart contracted versus diastole, which is going to be the heart relaxed. So technically with pulse, you're measuring the pressure when the heart is contracted versus the pressure when the heart is relaxed. So that's what you are doing in that world. The average pulse of an adult is going to be between 70 to 76 beats per minute. That is what you will hear with this heartbeat. The pulse should relate to that. When you're looking at pulse, if we have a little person who looks like this, and we're going to make him happy today, a couple places that you can detect pulse really, really well. You have a radial pulse. And a radial pulse is going to be where your radial bone is a radius. So that means it is typically going to be taken at the end of the radius. The main place for the radial pulse when you're taking this one is going to be between the arm and the hand. So this is the wrist. When you're taking the wrist pulse, you're taking the radial pulse. Another place you can take the pulse that is going to be the brachial. This is also going to be similar to the name of the bone. So that's going to be right here. This is technically going to be at your elbow. When you take the pulse right in the crook of your elbow, you're going to be doing it at you're measuring your brachial pulse. And then you're also going to have a common carotid pulse. When you are taking the common carotid pulse, you are actually taking it right here. So this is the one that is going to be in your neck. So when you go and work out, or really when I was in elementary school, that's when I remember doing it the most, and you put the two fingers on your neck, what you're actually measuring is the pulse of your common carotid artery, so your common carotid pulse. All of these pulses can flux slightly because if your heart is in the center of your chest here, depending on whether or not you are measuring pulse this close, which is very, very close, your common carotid is very close to your heart, whereas your radial pulse is farther away from your heart, there can be a little bit of flux. It is minute in the grand scheme of things, but you can detect a difference sometimes in the pulse with where you take it on the body. So another so when we are looking at this measure of the blood pressure against our artery wall, we're doing our systolic pressure over our systolic or diastolic pressure, and we're looking at our beats per minute with our pulse. We're also going to be measuring these pieces in milligrams per mercury. So we're going to take our blood pressure now. And I apologize, I skipped way ahead of my notes. So essentially, this whole little section right here, I skipped way too far ahead. This is going to come down here and be our blood pressure. This is talking about our pulse. Pulse is 70 to 76 beats per minute. You can take them at a couple different places. Those are three major ones. When we're going to do our blood pressure, I apologize, that is where we are going to be doing our systolic versus our diastolic. So when we're measuring this is normally going to be measured in millimeters per mercury. Millimeters per mercury. This is an older way of measuring. It's very similar to how temperature used to be taken with the little glass thermometers that you would hold under your tongue, millimeters per of mercury, how much the mercury would move in that little glass vial. We no longer measure it this way with the actual tool, but it's still done in millimeters per mercury. So that's what that mmHg means. But we are measuring the systolic pressure of the heart when it's contracted divided by the diastolic pressure when the heart is relaxed. So this is usually going to be around 120 over 80. So 120 millimeters per mercury over 80. This is considered normal. I've heard recently that they're actually recommending 110 over 70. Um, I'm not that involved in the current clinical world, but 120/80 or 110/70 are both considered normal for blood pressure related uh, concerns. So that is wrapping up exercise 33.